Hi, I'm Jay Link, President of Stewardship Ministries. One of the most radical giving messages in the entire New Testament is found in Luke 21, 1 through 4. You most likely have heard the story about the widow's mite. Most people completely miss how profound this story and Jesus' teaching on it is. In fact, Jesus, as He did on many occasions on many different subjects, turns the Old Testament teaching on giving on its ear with His comments. Here's the brief story. Jesus looked up and saw the rich putting in their gifts into the offering box. And He saw a poor widow put in 2 small copper coins. And He said, "Truly I tell you, this poor widow has put in more than all of them. For they all contributed out of their abundance, but she out of her poverty put in all that she had to live on." A person could all too easily read right through this story, be warmed by the sweetness of it, and move on. But we dare not overlook the fact that in Jesus' assessment, He reverses our commonly understood definitions of what makes big giving big and what makes small giving small. He changes the entire paradigm by identifying the widow as the big giver and the wealthy as the small givers. This poor widow has put in more than all of them, He said. To fully appreciate the extreme contrast in Jesus' comparison here, we need to understand that these 2 small copper coins that this poor widow gave was the equivalent of 1/64 of a common laborer's daily wage. Assuming minimum wage for an 8-hour day, her gift amounted to a measly 90 cents in today's dollars. Contrast this with the huge sums of money that Jesus observed the rich dropping into the offering box. Their giving may have been even bags of gold, surplus gold. And that is His point. Even the significant amounts of money the rich were parting with in their offering would have absolutely no immediate or long-term impact on their lives whatsoever. They were giving what they did not need and what they would not miss. In their giving, they were making no personal sacrifice at all. The widow, on the other hand, would likely feel the impact of her gift by dinner time that very day. Let me also note the percentage of giving that Jesus is endorsing here before we move on. You can check my math, but I believe it is 100%. Not just some arbitrary or perfunctory 10% tithe. He is praising and promoting 100% giving. That alone is off the charts extreme teaching. Let me pose a modern day comparison. In order to better understand what Jesus is actually saying here, let me give you a hypothetical modern-day situation to illustrate the extent of just how radical this redefining of what big giving is. Imagine that there are 2 members of your church. The first member is a poor elderly widow who is receiving about $12,000 a year in Social Security and who gives out of her meager annual income $500 a year to the church. The second member is a successful businessman who's giving $50,000 a year to the church from his $350,000 annual income. Comparison number 1. If you compare the total amount the 2 are giving, who is the big giver and who is the small giver? Pretty obvious. The businessman is the big giver and the widow is the small giver. The businessman is giving 100 times more than the widow. Comparison number 2. If you compare their giving as a percentage of their income, you will see that the widow is giving a very modest 4% of her income, an unacceptable amount in many churches' theology. The businessman, on the other hand, is giving a very healthy 14% of his income. If you compare the percentages of income the 2 are giving, the businessman is again the big giver and the widow is the small giver. The businessman is actually giving 3.5 times more than the widow. Comparison number 3. Jesus ignores these 2 normal methods of measuring the liberality of giving and instead institutes a brand new giving measurement never before used. Simply stated, here is Jesus' new definition for measuring your generous giving. Your degree of generosity is not based on how much you give. It is measured by how much you have left over after you give. This is such a profound truth. You cannot hear this statement just once and fully absorb it. So let me give it to you again. Your degree of generosity is not measured by how much you give. It is measured by how much you have left over after you give. Using Jesus' new definition to measure who is the bigger giver, we are not to compare their total giving, that's comparison 1, or even their percentage giving, comparison 2. We are to compare how much the widow and the businessman have left over after they made their respective gifts, comparison 3. The widow has a meager $11,500 left over to live on for the entire year, less than $1,000 a month, while the businessman must struggle to make ends meet on his remaining $300,000 salary, $25,000 a month. The message is unmistakably clear here. Jesus' teaching in this case is telling us that the widow who gave only $500 is a much bigger giver than the businessman who liberally gave $50,000. Jesus has thrown us an incredible curve in His comparison in Luke 21 when He identified the poor widow, not the rich, as the bigger giver. Let me share with you the most generous person I've ever personally known. I've worked with many affluent families over the past 30 years, and I've helped them to make several substantial gifts to the kingdom. However, when I think about the most generous person I've ever known, none of these committed and willing givers reach the top of my list. The top position goes to a 10-year-old boy named Jimmy Mitchell, who was a member of my church back when I was preaching as a young man well over 30 years ago. One Sunday before church, I was standing up at the pulpit getting my sermon notes ready, and Jimmy comes running into the auditorium of our very small country church in rural Kentucky. He runs up to me with a $1 bill in his hand and said, "Jay, look what I got." I said, "Jimmy, that's great. Where did you get it?" He told me that after he mowed his yard, he decided to go ahead and mow his elderly neighbor's yard next door because she wasn't able to get around very well. He excitedly exclaimed, "After I finished, she came out and gave me this $1." He then paused and gave me a reflective look and said, "You know, Jay, I'd like to give some of this $1 to the Lord." Touched by his comment, I replied, "Jimmy, I know the Lord would be so pleased that you would want to share some of that $1 with Him. How much do you think you'd like to give Him?" Even after over 3 decades now, I still remember his penetrating words like it was yesterday. He looked down at the $1 and then questioningly looked up at me and asked, "Do you think He would mind if I kept a dime?" His words still ring in my mind to this day. Do you think He would mind if I kept a dime? Jimmy knew whose $1 it was, and he was just hoping to enjoy some small benefit from it having passed through his hands on its way back to its rightful owner for his use and his purposes. Even after 30 years, Jimmy Mitchell still remains the most generous giver I've ever personally known. Not because of the total amount of the gift, a meager 90 cents, or even the amazing percentage of his giving, 90%, but because of the amount he had left over after he made the gift, 1 thin dime. I've never personally given this sacrificially and extravagantly at any time in my life. Have you? Can you imagine what the kingdom of God would be like today if it were full of believers who thought and acted like Jimmy Mitchell? The degree of your generosity is not measured by how much you give. It is measured by how much you have left over after you give. This new definition of what makes a person a big giver should challenge all of us to reassess our current level of giving to determine if we should be thinking of ourselves even as big givers at all. It may be that based upon Jesus' revolutionary new definition of what it means to be a big giver, some of us who may have previously thought of ourselves as big givers aren't all that big givers after all. And many of us who likely have never thought of ourselves as big givers indeed really are.